Have you ever been asked what were the biggest mistakes Germany made in World War II? Actions that still to this day are neither clear nor understood. Beginner mistakes. A total contempt for the enemy's combat capacity, or an excessive confidence in themselves, were what led the German army to be involved in catastrophic situations that, without a doubt, cost them the war. Next, chronologically, we are going to see the 10 most important errors of the Wehrmacht. We found the first mistake after a brilliant operation to defeat France, precisely in Dunkirk, when the order was given to the German vanguards to stop putting pressure on the French and British who were isolated in Dunkirk. The new plan was that the Luftwaffe would be in charge of attacking these troops that were embarking towards Great Britain. Finally, the attack by the German Air Force was very ineffective, and did not represent any impediment in this evacuation known as Operation Dynamo. This error resulted in the evacuation of some 300,000 British soldiers who managed to escape between May 26 and June 4, 1940. There is no doubt that both the German armored divisions that had crossed the Ardennes, and the infantry divisions who had made their way through Holland and Belgium, had suffered some wear and tear. However, and despite the fact that his condition was not ideal, there was not a general on the field who did not insist that he wanted to continue until the Allied units in Dunkirk were completely annihilated. There has been much speculation about whether Hitler was truly frightened by a possible French attack on the rear of his panzer divisions, or whether letting a large part of the British army escape was a show of goodwill to reach peace. Be that as it may, to get Britain to surrender, nothing would have been more effective than capturing these hundreds of thousands of men. With Great Britain off the board, Germany would have been able to employ part of the more than 50 divisions that had to cover the Western Front when Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union began a year later. We found the next error shortly after, that same summer of 1940 in his air attack on England. In it, Germany made a series of fatal mistakes that led it to lose some 1,800 aircraft of all types, as well as a large number of experienced pilots in exchange for nothing. The errors were, among others, not giving importance to the English radar network, and miscalculating the production levels of British aircraft, believing that it was much lower than it really was. Furthermore, constantly changing objectives was not something that helped them focus on one in particular. This error resulted in the loss of a large number of experienced aircraft and pilots, as we have just mentioned, and left the Luftwaffe quite depleted for the rest of the war campaigns. The third error on our list is the excessive confidence with which Operation Barbarossa was planned. During this planning, many German leaders and senior officers refused to believe alarming reports that gave a vision of the Red Army much more powerful than they believed. In this way, with the belief that the Soviet army would dissolve after the first confrontations, after which the Soviet Union would collapse, an operation was planned that was supposed to last between 2 and 3 months at most. After this time, and seeing that the Soviet Union continued to be capable of putting large armies on the ground, the Germans limited themselves to trying to destroy as many enemy units as possible, until autumn, and later winter, came upon them. Although this is a mistake that was almost impossible to see at the time, most analysts suggest that the Germans should have stopped the offensive in mid-October, when the sticky mud made advance practically impossible. With this action, the German army would have remained in very good condition, waiting to be able to resume its attacks during the following summer with all its capacity. Instead, during November and December they continued to wear themselves out, finally leaving themselves in a very exposed situation that the Red Army took advantage of to launch a major counterattack along the entire Eastern Front line during December 1941. It is estimated that this fateful decision cost the Wehrmacht some 400,000 casualties, among which were its oldest and best trained soldiers. Thus, due to this final attrition, the German army no longer had enough power during the following summer to launch a triple offensive simultaneously. The fourth error that we want to comment on is the declaration of war that Germany made against the United States on December 11, 1941. As you know, this declaration was made at the worst possible moment for Germany, since its armies were retreating in the face of the Great Soviet attack on the Eastern Front. Although at that time Germany and the United States were already unofficially at war, This declaration accelerated American invasion plans in Africa, and later in France. His entry also came at the worst possible moment, just in November 1942, a few days before the other great German setback in the war, this being Stalingrad. On the other hand, thinking that Japan would join the war against the Soviet Union to return the favor to Germany was one of the greatest fantasies of the war. If Japan had not supported Germany in its war against Stalin when they were at peace, how did the Germans expect Japan to do so right after entering the war against the United States? In short, although war between them was inevitable, there is no doubt that if they had not declared war on the United States on this date, their entry into the European theater of operations would have been delayed until at least mid-1943. The fifth mistake is found in Africa, when the Germans missed their opportunity by having taken the island of Malta and continued advancing towards Egypt with their maritime logistics lines at the mercy of the British Navy and aviation. Without medium or long-term planning, and without paying the necessary attention until the last moment, the campaign in North Africa became a real waste of resources for the Germans without any benefit. Although Rommel has always been seen as a genius, the truth is that his continuous improvisations in Africa were a headache for the German High Command. Let's now look at the sixth mistake, this being the one committed in November 1942 when the encirclement of German troops occurred in Stalingrad, which was almost followed by the rest of the German army group south that was in the Caucasus. Even today, it is still being analyzed how the Germans were able to ignore so many signs that clearly indicated to them that a massive attack was going to occur on their flanks in the vicinity of Stalingrad. In any case, Operation Blue itself was doomed to failure after the numerous rectifications that were made along the way, which sought to achieve more objectives than the German attacking force could cover. Without going into the reasons why the Germans allowed themselves to be surrounded in Stalingrad, which we have already analyzed in other programs, this mistake meant the disappearance of the most powerful army that Germany had, and the loss of confidence of its Italian allies. Romanians and Hungarians, who also lost numerous troops during the months of November and December 1942. Very possibly this catastrophe could have been avoided, if the German High Command had not believed that its Soviet enemy was about to be defeated, and the German Sixth Army had been limited only to protecting the northern flank from the rest of the German units advancing towards the Caucasus. Be that as it may, this defeat marked one of the most important turning points of the war, which made the Germans see that they would never be able to defeat the Soviet Union, and that this enemy was much tougher than they could have ever imagined. However, just because they couldn't win, didn't mean they couldn't reach a draw, and this is going to be mistake number 7 on our list, being that of Operation Citadel. If in the summer of 1943 there was a sector that under no circumstances could be attacked by the Germans, due to the impregnable defense that the Soviets had established on it, it was undoubtedly the Kursk salient. It was there that the Germans concentrated all the armored forces they were capable of, and launched them against a trap perfectly planned by the Soviets. Once the Germans exhausted themselves in their attempt to penetrate their enemy's defensive belts, the Soviets attacked the German rear in both the Ural salient and the Donets basin, marking the end of all German hope for achieving one last great victory on the Eastern Front. The victory at Kursk would have meant a very important breath of oxygen for the Germans, and the recovery of confidence in them on the part of their allies. However, with defeat they achieved the opposite. In short, events showed that it would have been much better to attack somewhere else where the Soviets were not expecting it, or to have established defensive positions waiting for the Red Army to be the first to attack. From this point on, we can continue listing German errors in the war, although they are of minor importance, since if one thing or another had been done, the result of the war would have been practically the same. The only difference would have been to have prolonged the bitter end for a few more months. Still, we can highlight several that still had a great impact. The first of them is that of not having detected with complete certainty that the Allied attack on France was going to take place in Normandy. Just by having detected the Allied landing in Normandy a few hours in advance, and having sent the corresponding reinforcements, the German forces would have abysmally increased their chances of rejecting the invasion. After this, the British and Americans would not have been able to organize another landing until the following year, and the Germans would have been able to focus on the Eastern Front. Another error that also occurred in June 1944 was not finding out what the main Soviet attack sector was going to be during Operation Bagration, which led to the German armored reserves being poorly located. And finally, we move on to the last error, which we are going to leave more open so that everyone can discuss it in the comments. We are referring to the Ardennes Offensive of December 1944. The truth is that once this operation is analyzed, one quickly comes to the conclusion that it was completely impossible for the German armored vehicles to reach Antwerp and complete all the objectives set. In any case, the question here is, what else could they do given the circumstances? Would it have been of any use to employ these troops in another operation? As you know, the worn-out forces that had participated in the Ardennes had to leave in mid-January for the Hungarian front to launch again in what was known as Operation Spring Awakening, which was again launched in the worst place and in the worst possible moment. So, what do you think of these errors? Would you include any more? Which do you consider was the most important of all?